Are we ever going to have a situation where AI can come up with award-winning creative campaign ideas that connect emotionally with audiences, or is that always going to be something humans do?
For someone who deals with data and engineering, Google Ads sounds like the logical step in a career for a young Jono Matusky. So what happened there then?
So this is an example, I guess, of maybe thinking that you're smarter than you are, right? Like it's like the worst possible thing you could do. Like if somebody asks you to run Google Ads, it's one thing if you run the ads and they get no clicks. That's bad. But if you run the ads and you actively get them deplatformed,
that's literally worse than getting no clicks, isn't it? And it's a new client as well. The new client, the first project.
Welcome back to Embracing Marketing Mistakes, the podcast all about the biggest screw-ups the world's best marketers have ever made and what they've learned from them, so you don't go doing the same thing. I'm your host, Chris Norton, and today I'm excited to introduce Jono Matusky, founder and CEO of Newsprint AI, an automation aficionado, and a fearful user of Google Ads. Jono has had a varied career. He's also the first father and son combo that we've ever had on the podcast after having his dad. He launched a not-for-profit incubator program in Cuba until international geopolitics got in the way. He's navigated the highs and lows of marketing campaigns, including one very memorable Google Ads screw-up. He created a brilliant media monitoring tool combining the wonders of AI and the time struggles of marketers to ultimately create efficiency for marketing professionals. This is interesting. And in this episode, we'll be asking Jono all about his career, his love of AI and agents, and of course, the biggest mistakes that have brought him to where he is today, which you can all learn from. So, as always, sit back, relax, and let's hear more about how you can use AI to track your business's performance. Hi, Jono. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Welcome as the first son of the father and son combo to ever appear on this show as well.
That's great. Yeah, it's a shame we couldn't be on together. I'm sure that'd be a pretty interesting convo.
We'll do that one later in the year, I think.
Yeah.
Do you ever do shows? Do you ever do interviews with him?
No, I haven't. That actually sounds like a lot of fun. My dad's actually in Davos at the moment. He's sending us photos on the family group chat for their AI summit, which is pretty exciting. But no, haven't done any podcast appearances together yet.
Okay. Well, I mean, when we look at your career, varied is the word that I would open with.
Yeah.
So, do you want to tell us how you got started and what you're experienced in? Because we'll get into the world of AI later on, but I think the fact where you started and how you've got to where you'd be would be quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I went to Carnegie Mellon University and got an engineering degree, and then quickly got my MBA while I was there, and started working for a venture-backed startup that spun out of Carnegie Mellon that was doing energy storage. So we were building, large-scale battery systems for renewable energy projects, and it was, a new battery chemistry called sodium ion that nowadays is getting a little bit more attention. Obviously, lithium-ion batteries are the popular one. But kind of came in on the business side. So I was working as a product manager for Aqueon Energy was the name of the company. And kind of got my hands dirty in a startup, which was really exciting, and kind of caught the bug. And so worked there for a few years and then ultimately left to go help start up an incubator program in Havana, Cuba. So this was an opportunity that was, essentially working with early stage founders and kind of playing chief of staff role for different companies, or kind of helping them figure out how to launch their services or products abroad, how to build relationships with U.S. companies. So this was in the period where, U.S. was sort of normalizing relations with Cuba, and there was an opportunity for that. And the hope was really to build up, a community and connections with entrepreneurs, and ultimately, we ultimately fund some of them. We helped a lot of startups, which was really great. But unfortunately, relations kind of soured between the two countries somewhat unexpectedly. So we had to, essentially shut our things. The hope was that maybe we could reopen them after a couple of years, but it sort of just proved infeasible. So after that, I pretty much continued doing the same thing I was doing down there, but just in the US. So started working with early stage, VC-backed companies. Again, kind of providing just general kind of either chief of staff or more technology implementation services. So started working with companies who, had some funding and needed some help. Rolling out, standardizing their processes or rolling out new software. And this was sort of where I got more involved with AI. While I was at Carnegie Mellon, I took machine learning classes. It wasn't, they called it AI. We weren't really calling it AI at the time. But obviously, conversations around open AI and generative AI were starting to bubble up. And that was around the same time that my dad's firm, Gregory FCA, got a little bit of private equity funding. And so they were looking to acquire some other companies and, roll out new software, and also they were starting to dabble in the AI world. And so I started kind of consulting for them and kind of helping them with some of the stuff they were working on. And it quickly became apparent that they needed a little bit more than part-time support. So I kind of came on as, I guess, quote unquote, chief innovation officer, to sort of help, kind of standardize things they were doing across the company, roll out new software, and then really build out what we were doing in AI. And so, my dad and I were really early to that to some extent, or at least bringing it over to the marketing side. I remember when, GPT-3 launched, that was pre-Chat GPT, and you could sort of we generated a press release, using some of those tools. And it was really exciting to sort of just see that appear on your screen. And then obviously when Chat GPT rolled out, probably about a year later, that's when things really took off. But yeah, so started playing around more on the AI side there, and then left Gregory FCA about a year and a half ago to start Newsprint, which is my current endeavor, which is we're essentially doing AI curated and AI written executive briefings, so executive news briefings for busy executives and communications professionals. So at Gregory FCA, a lot of the companies that we worked with were very keen on having some sort of brief in their inbox every day that was really focused on the news that they cared about as a company, right? So like mentions of their company, their competitors, their industry, regulatory updates, just any critical information that they might need to know. And in most cases, a human being has to write that, and they got to go read all these headlines and articles and sift through them and, collate them and write up a summary. And so we're essentially training AI agents to do that for you, as sort of our initial product. And the vision is really to make this something that's available to all companies. So any company could, you could have an internal news briefing focused on the information that's most relevant to you. And then also using that as a way to build out, analysis of the news and recommend, sort of actionable recommendations that PR professionals or communications professionals could use to decide, where they should be spending their time or their effort, who they should be pitching to, what types of podcasts, they should be going on, things like that. So yeah, no, that was a bit long-winded,
Well,
but a little bit of a winding journey.
I know.
Yeah,
I almost
that's how I ended
I
up here.
sort of interrupted you halfway through because you mentioned the Cuba thing, because the AI thing's fascinating and we're going to get into it. But I was just like, you worked in Cuba. I went on holiday to Cuba, and I think once I came back with a new
nice.
sense of what communism is all about. And I did, because we went into the local town and everything. We took a taxi and saw how the locals lived. A lot of people go on holiday there and don't see any of it, do they? They just go and stay in the 5-star hotels. But we went into the local towns and everything, and it was fascinating. How the heck did you run a company out there? Was that completely unusual?
Yeah, so we basically had a U.S. based nonprofit called the Innovadores Foundation, and we were partnering with a non-government NGO down there called the Ludwig Foundation. So yeah, I mean, Cuba's a very interesting place. Like, I'm happy to go into it, but generally, think about communism, right? And in many cases, in many ways, Cuba is, probably the closest thing to a true communist state, in terms of compared to, where many countries are at now, who are sort of part of the Soviet bloc. But you have the state. I mean, for a long time, that any enterprise exists in the state. So you don't have nonprofits, you don't have companies, obviously, right? If you want to buy something, you go to a state-run store, and all those things in that state-run store are made by state-run enterprises. But also, the thing that was sort of surprising is, again, they don't really have there's no nonprofit entities. There's no entities that exist outside of the state, really. And so that was but there's like a handful. There's maybe 12 in Cuba that are technically NGOs, and they kind of have the ability to operate with a little bit of flexibility in terms of what they do. So the Ludwig Foundation is an arts foundation that works with artists who in many cases are like the entrepreneurial class of Cuba, because for up until, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, you couldn't really make money outside of working for the government, unless you were in very strict categories of entrepreneurship, right? And so for a long time, that was kind of artists who could sell their artwork, musicians who could like travel abroad or who could record albums and sell things like that. And there's a couple other categories. You could go abroad and make money. So anyway, so this company, this NGO was sort of a natural partner for us, and so we were trying to essentially build an incubator on like the top floor of their building that would be dedicated to entrepreneurs and kind of using the arts as our initial entry point. So we worked with clothing designers called Clandestina. They do these really awesome like shirts and bags, and they sell them largely in their store in Havana, and then we were helping them essentially launch their brand internationally, and getting them into e-commerce and building partnerships with labels outside of Cuba. Worked with video game developers, so like initially kind of worked with folks who were on that line between artist and entrepreneur, and then use that as a way to then start working with more traditional entrepreneurs that, you might think of in the US, like software developers, and folks building apps and websites. But it was, yeah, very, very, educational, as it sounds like for you as well. When you visit there, especially if you go behind the scenes and kind of see how it really works. It's
because
extremely
the state, as you said,
experience.
The state runs and owns everything, right down to the hotel shop. We had a hotel shop, and the state run that. The state owns all the traffic that looks modern. Everything else that's local is all old school. They don't update. They haven't got enough money to do it. And then one of the fascinating things that we had was we had a barman in our hotel who was a brain surgeon but made more money behind the bar because of the tips, because they all get paid the same salary.
Yeah,
it was. Yeah. So to run a business in a purely communist society like that is fascinating. That you were behind the scenes and doing that. It's really, really interesting. I never got to go to Havana, so that is supposed to be an amazing city. So I bet that was a fascinating experience and a good career grounder.
Yeah, it is a remarkable
good
place.
Career grounder, good place to start your career or whatever.
Yeah, it was certainly, you learn a lot very quickly. I have a lot of respect for, Cuba and the Cuban people and the folks that we got to work with. It was just sort of unfortunate. I mean, hey, I did fine, got to go on and work on other things in my career. But obviously a lot of the folks that we worked with, things didn't exactly go the way that they hoped. Many of them are still in Cuba. Most of them have since left. They've gone abroad and they're either starting their companies outside of the country, or they have gone to work for other companies, or they've gone to grad school. It was a really, it's tough. Tough. You come in as sort of an outsider, as an American into Cuba. And in many ways, I think like geopolitical forces certainly meant that we had to stop, but it didn't necessarily impact my career particularly negatively. But, certainly the folks that we worked with have had a much harder time kind of navigating that experience.
Going from focusing on newsprint for a moment, because there's a few themes here which I think would be quite interesting to unpack. So first of all, you mentioned while at Gregory FCA, a lot of the work you did or your teams did, is a sort of fairly traditional senior consultant type of role, isn't it? Executive briefings, recommendations off those briefings in terms of what that means from a comms perspective. I mean, as a starting point, that's hugely time consuming, isn't it? I mean, have you got any kind of insight into how long teams will, if you think about an annual contract, I mean, that's a huge amount of time, isn't it, every week in terms of researching what's happening, making recommendations.
Yeah. No, I mean, so right now, I think, as a founder, you're constantly learning. And I think through our interactions and advisors, I think the one thing that we've been migrating towards and are now really kind of going down is focusing on enterprise customers, so larger scale companies, right, who can spend thousands of dollars a month on a subscription instead of hundreds or tens, right? And obviously, newsprint, the idea of having a daily news briefing is something that appeals to a lot of people. Like we have a lot of individuals who sign up and want to try newsprint. But the reason we're focused on enterprise in many ways is because some of them are spending $10,000 a month, $20,000 a month, thousands and thousands of dollars a month just to get these sort of executive briefings, because they want, every source that's mentioning forever chemicals, right? Or, they want to know about every time their company is mentioned in the news and how they were mentioned, right? Or they have 200 different energy projects around the country or the world, and they want to know about any time one of those is mentioned, right? And yeah, that's really time consuming. I mean, that takes someone out, or a team, hours a day to kind of put that together, depending on the size of the company, right? Publicly traded company that maybe has a bunch of projects or has subsidiaries, that you're talking hours a day. You're talking $10,000+ a month contract. Smaller companies obviously have less news typically, unless you're a startup, right? And maybe you're getting a lot of attention. So they have less of a need. Maybe their competitors are getting less news. They don't have as many products, right? So there's definitely like a sliding scale of how much time someone would have to spend. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot. And you're looking through a combination of, traditional media, but then also you're looking through industry specific newsletters or members only, news publications, and just trying to pull all that together. And so, yeah, it's an extremely time consuming and in many cases not very rewarding process for a human being to do. Like,
Yeah,
it's
I was going to
really
say,
tedious work.
yeah, and when you're kind of coming up with a concept for an AI tool that solves a problem, do you have a kind of a certain criteria? Because it sounds like you're looking at those tasks that are time intensive and there's no particular alternative, because if you look at that, it's immediately time intensive, isn't it, as a
Right.
task? So do you look at those kind of tasks and think that, there's potential to automate that, that there must be a way to automate that through AI? I mean, talk us through your kind of your thought process, I suppose, when it comes to coming up with a solution like newsprint.
Yeah. So, the obviously at Gregory FCA, I got to spend a lot of time solving a variety of different problems. So we built, like an AI press release generator, basically. So you could go in and we had a very guided process where you answered some questions and it wrote, a much higher quality release than you would just get if you just dropped in a chat GPT and tried to get it to write something for you. And we experimented with building out like a spokesperson database, so having like an internal database of all of our clients and their spokespeople or their executives who could comment on certain issues, and a bunch of other things, right? So we experimented with sort of a bunch of bespoke and just different software solutions to solve different problems internally. And yeah, I think the reason that newsprint is where it is that I saw a problem that companies were paying for, right? Like that is in many cases for a startup and for an entrepreneur. I think if you're going to try to solve a problem, the best problem you can try to solve is something that one, people are already paying for, right? Like whether they have someone on staff who's dedicating hours out of their day to solve a problem, or they're paying an outside agency or whatever the case may be. If they're dedicating dollars to it and you can say, hey, we can replace that with AI, in many cases for higher quality, right? We can write briefs faster than a human being can do. We can write that. We can actually pull in more sources. We can summarize a bunch of different sources all at once and reference them. Do things that would be difficult for a human being to do. So that was sort of criteria number one, is like what are the problems that companies are paying for, and in many cases, like Gregory FCA actually wouldn't do this work because it's so tedious and doesn't deliver that much value that, clients would expect. Hey, we want to know about when our company's mentioned, obviously, like that's sort of PR basics. Like they want to know when our company's mentioned, how are they mentioned, right? They want to get an email about it, and they want it to show up in their monthly, analytics, report at the end of the month. But many of them would ask for these sort of news briefings, and it largely was something that Gregory of CA would stay away from. And it's just, it's just very tedious, and the value add is pretty low. The amount of time that their team would have to spend doing it versus like how much you could add to the retainer, it didn't really make sense. And so many companies either do it themselves, or they, shoehorn their PR firm and get them to do it for them, or they pay a different monitoring, like a dedicated monitoring agency that does these briefings. And so that was sort of criteria number one, is like, is there a problem that people are paying for a solution for? And then criteria number two is kind of like what we got at of, do people really hate doing it? Like, do people not enjoy doing it themselves or paying the agency to do it? Are they not satisfied with what the solution looks like? And that was kind of, the sort of guiding principle, I guess, or the reason that, newsprint is sort of taking the form that it is because it's solving a problem that people feel enough that they're paying for and that they don't particularly enjoy doing.
And how is it better or different to existing solutions? So, for example, a social media monitoring solution that
Google
gives you
Alerts.
automatic alerts when a category, Google Alerts as well, when a category or a brand name's mentioned. I understand there is a big difference, but it'd be good to hear it from you.
Yeah, no, totally. Yeah. Obviously there's a ton of tools you can use. If you say, hey, I want to know about X, Y, and Z, you could set up a Google alert. You could, if you're using tools like Cision or Muckrack, right, you could set up alerts through that. There's a bunch of different tools that offer, there's like NewsWhip if you want to do social media. There's all sorts of tools you can kind of do to monitor and get summaries, right? Where that usually falls down is typically it's often a fire hose, right? So you're often getting just a ton of information that isn't particularly useful. And so, where that often comes out is if you have a company that gets mentioned a lot, right? Because they're publicly traded or they're just a hot company, right? If you try to set up an alert, it's constantly getting mentioned. Some of those mentions matter. Most of them don't. They're from publications that you don't know about, or they're random social media posts. And so part of it is just a filtering problem, right? And so how can you use AI to understand, right, what the audience cares about, what the user wants to see, and go beyond just keyword filters, right? So, you could say, just basically tell our AI, I only want to see news from top tier publications that mention our company in relation to X, Y, and Z, right? Mention this particular product that our company offers, or, I want to know about this competitor, but only in this market, right? You might have a competitor that serves a bunch of different markets and you only care about one of their products, right? And so, part of it is just using essentially, AI agents, right? So AI kind of working in the background to read news before it ever reaches your desk and kind of filtering it out. So that's one big difference, is that most other companies still rely on either like Boolean traditional searches, or they have some level of machine learning, but it's mostly just entity recognition. So you're identifying the name of a company and then pulling that in. So we go beyond that and actually have AI agents that understand what you care about and why. And then the other side, it's how do you sort of synthesize or combine all that information from these different sources, right? So it's one thing to say, I want a summary of a news article, but I mean, what most folks care about is how was our company talked about, right? Or what are multiple different publications all saying about this event or this particular issue? And so, are there different viewpoints of how this is sort of being talked about, right? And traditionally that was done with things like sentiment, right? Which is still pretty subjective. What you really want to know is just like, how did this reporter talk about this topic, right? Or how do they talk about our company? Like, what's a one sentence summary? Or did they quote one of our executives, and what was that quote, right? Did they quote a competitor? What are all the regulatory news? What were all the regulatory updates today? Just summarized as a bulleted list. And so, that's sort of the other half, is once we have that information, our AI can decide how best to summarize it in a way that is as efficient for delivering that information as possible, right? So it's not just a list of headlines. It's not just, full text articles that somebody on your team has to read through. It can actually write, a fairly interesting newsletter that just delivers the information that matters to you.
Can it have personality then? Instead of so for instance, could we have because our show's we've been called irreverent because of the mistakes issue, and we always talk about marketing mistakes. So could your AI agent create a newsletter that would send us a newsletter all about people talking about marketing mistakes around the world at any point? Is that what it could do? And it could write it in an entertaining way, like talking about examples that would make good people on the show. Is that?
Yeah. So yes. There's a couple answers to that in terms of like the different elements of it, right? But on the one end, could it write irreverently? Like absolutely, right? And we've all messed with ChatGPT and tried to get it to write in certain styles or whatever. So we for our summaries, you can specify sort of each for the overall newsletter, as well as, what specific sections you would like it to include, right? And you can completely change that tone, right? And so you could say, write it as if you are an intelligent business analyst. You could say, write it, and you can say, write it, be funny, focus on the mistakes that people made. So you can tell it not just what you're interested in, but how you want that information summarized and formatted and what kind of style you're going for. It also has information about you as an audience. So as it's both filtering and writing, it's writing it to the audience, right? It's all part of all great marketing, right? So you could sort of explain what the purpose of this newsletter is, right? So, it's whether it's for you internally, and it's just for you guys to find opportunities of who to have on the podcast, or this is a companion piece to your podcast and you're distributing it to your followers, then it would understand that, right? So it can write to the specific audience, but then the other side is sort of finding news. So right now, Newsprint is really focused on sort of traditional media. We're expanding into social media. We're experimenting with podcasts and pulling in information from those sources. But at the moment, we are focused on traditional media, and so something would have to get written up, right? So if folks were writing a thought, it's like a thought leadership piece in, Forbes or, something like that, or they talked about a mistake that they made, that's where we could pick something like that up. But, certainly there are other ways that we could pull it in, right? So it's one thing, hey, they write an article about, hey, we made a mistake. The other nice thing about Newsprint, though, is it could find an article where someone maybe offhand mentions a mistake that they made, right? Or or they talk about something, but they don't necessarily use those words. And you can sort of say to it, I want a newsletter that helps us find, folks who made marketing mistakes. And it will go out and do its best to kind of fill in that newsletter, even if it can't just use search terms, and it can't, somebody didn't just write an article that's specifically focused on that. And so that's sort of another nuance of Newsprint, is it can kind of surface information that would be very difficult to find otherwise, and that you probably
and is it
it's
daily?
see.
Is it daily? Is that fair?
It's
yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So it goes. Yeah. Typically, we have folks who are who've like asked about doing weekly, but typically most of our customers want it daily, because that means they really have the need, and they're willing to sort of pay the the price we're hoping to get. But yeah, typically every morning. Yeah.
I'm quite interested here in where AI can replace genuine insights. So obviously the role of the PR is to kind of analyze the media landscape on a daily basis, and then draw on their years of experience and make recommendations into what this means for said company. Now, did you say the tool to a degree does that, makes recommendations on the back of the insight it pulls in? And if so, is there any risk of AI bias? Example being Tesla. Let's say we're analyzing Tesla, huge narratives about Elon Musk being evil and aligning with Trump and doing questionable salutes on stage. So how do you kind of mitigate that?
Yeah. So
thanks for bringing that up, Will.
Good question. Yeah. No, it's a really good question. So that I'll say, I mean, you guys are in the
Yeah.
industry, right? So you kind of get it. So most folks who read the news for the news. They read it for the information contained in the article, right? And so that's kind of what newsprint is still focused on right now, which is essentially just what is information coming in real time that matters to my company. And so we look back. So we try to not provide include in the newsletter something that's already been talked about unless there's new information related to that, right? Unless there's like a meaningful update. But right now we don't necessarily do sort of trend analysis or like meta analysis of how is Tesla being talked about across all publications, right? And that gets much more at PR needs is that sort of meta intelligence, right? So it's not just you're not reading the news because you care about what this specific article or a couple of articles say. You're reading the news because you want to know the sort of meta information of how has this story been changing over time across every publication that's written about it, or who are the journalists that are covering this particular piece of information positively or negatively, or how is Tesla, right, being talked about? What are the different facets of Tesla news coverage, right? And so that is something that we're building out now and trying to experiment a bit more with. And that's something that's going to be more about giving PR and communications professionals tools to analyze it themselves, basically. So kind of giving them access to the information that we now have kind of in our database and in our AI to let them ask interesting questions and determine, and kind of figure out for themselves how they want to use it, right? And so like a simple example is what we're going to be experimenting with is the idea that you could essentially like ask a question and have it answer that question across as many different articles as speak about a topic as possible, and then have it write up sort of a meta analysis. So like, imagine you would want to know, when reviewers, or when people talk about our product online, do they talk about this feature positively or negatively, right? Or what do they say about this feature, right? And then you could basically have the AI read all the articles that ever mention that product, kind of put it into different categories or answer your question, and then make that now actionable, analytical, data driven intelligence. And so that's where we're hoping to go with this,
I mean,
right? So
that's
Market research,
incredibly
by the sounds
powerful,
of
isn't
it.
it?
Yeah.
For comms, comms professionals, it just allows you to be so responsive and have your finger on the pulse exactly, really understand the media sentiment at all times. I mean, what a feature that would be.
yeah, that's the hope. So we're just going to start experimenting with that in the next couple of months. Yeah, it's just one of those things where now we've kind of built out the pipeline, and the data pipeline. We have a lot of information in our database, but we also have a pretty robust AI agent platform on the back end that is first and foremost just for generating the newsletters, but you can kind of see it. You can imagine, right? If you're saying, hey, I care about this topic, but I care about this element of the topic and I want it to go in this section of my newsletter, maybe you want that every day, but maybe you actually only care about that right now, because something happened. And so that's going to be what we're going to, trying to do over the next few months is, can we just essentially turn over our tools to folks to kind of use in real time rather than just a daily newsletter.
I'm curious what's next. Now, clearly, you don't want to reveal the next product you're going to launch, but it's clear between yourself and your father, you're AI experts in the world of comms. You're not just talking about it; you're actually delivering products. So you talked about the press release tool that Greg built. You've got the newsprint tool. What other sort of clear use cases can you see for AI in PR agencies or marketing agencies? Those time-intensive tasks that just make no sense for humans to do them.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there's going to be a lot. I think it's going to be an exciting couple of years. And to be honest, if AI didn't advance at all from today, right, and we just had the capabilities we had, we would still see a lot of change just in terms of the adoption and spread of the existing tech and people actually using it as well as they could. And so I think there's a lot of places where this can be used and should be used. Um, you know, so like Write Release, our press release generator, that's a great example of just like day one AI. That's like, hey, I've got this long thing I got to write, and I want an AI to help me do it. And so, I think a lot of that content generation is going to get turned over to AIs. But I do think the question is, who's going to be reading those press releases, right? Is it going to be a human, or is it going to be AIs reading those press releases and using that information to make decisions, right? And so that type of stuff, I think we're going to see more and more, where now you have AI, you've content that's being generated or information that's being published so that it can be consumed by AIs, right? And I think that will, in many cases, change the way that journalism works, right? I
AI
think
news editors, then, is that what you're talking
essentially,
about?
yeah. I mean, I do think there's a future, right? I mean, if you talk about journalists, right, there are many great journalists who aren't particularly great writers, and there are many great journalists who are great writers, but there are many journalists who are really good at turning up interesting, important information, or have connections in certain industries, or have really interesting insights. And in many cases, their job is actually just surfacing that, is muckraking. It's surfacing that information and making it so that it can see the light of day. And writing the article is somewhat of secondary importance. And I think that we will certainly see that, where you have essentially AI journalists as researchers turning up valuable information and getting that information then really being summarized by AI, or even just being used by AI. So I think that's going to be exciting. I think for marketers, what I'm really excited to see is where sort of AI agents go. So AI agents being AI that runs in the background, so you don't have to sit there and ask questions of a chatbot and have it spit information out. But essentially, you could ask an AI agent to say, hey, can you go write up or do an analysis of who all the key stakeholders are in this industry in this country, or something like that, right? And it would then just go out and do online research, or pull from different databases, or use your in-house tools and have access to those, and just pull all that information together and write up a little report with sources, kind of answering that question. And so I think we're still at the early days of that, especially in marketing. I mean, I don't really know of any AI agents that are designed for marketers. Most of them are still more so on the software development side. But I think we're going to see more and more of that. So you won't necessarily have to sit in front of ChatGPT and ask it to do stuff for you. I think soon we'll be able to, ask it to do a task, and it'll come back when
ChatGPT
it's
last
ready.
week, I think, launched tasks, didn't it? So tasks are the agents that you're talking about, where you ask it to do a task and it'll go off and do it. I quite like the idea that you can ask it to go off and create, look at something or read something for you. And the thing that's annoying about the various different AIs, and I know you've built a platform on it, is that you have to stay in the same chat if you want it to remember the things that you've discussed before. But you're talking about, I like the personalized GPTs, where you can create them all around an audience, all around a particular and a frame of reference, and then you can have chats with that particular one. You don't have to keep telling it all the same things over and over. Surely that they're going to get cleverer and cleverer, aren't they?
Yeah, and I mean AI. So OpenAI launched tasks, and right now their task is super simple. It's basically, you can just schedule a chat. So you say, at this time of day, I want you to answer this prompt. So it's kind of like scheduled prompts that send you an alert. But I think that they're doing it because one, I think it's because they want you to turn on desktop notifications so that when you're chatting, they can send you notifications. But I think what their plan is to have that be the inroad to more sophisticated AI agents that can kind of do work for you on the background. And to your point of these sort of GPTs, right, where you can have customized chatbots, basically with maybe particular personalities, or access to certain information, or access to tools outside of ChatGPT. I think we're going to see more of that. I think where it's kind of exciting is there's a lot of folks experimenting with essentially using different types of AI agents to accomplish different tasks. And we do a little bit of this at Newsprint. So essentially giving certain types of agents certain amounts of information or access to certain tools, and then having almost like a router AI agent that can kind of decide based on what you asked, okay, who should I refer this over to, right? So right now they kind of call it tool calling, which is like, I could ask it, hey, I need to do I need to find stakeholders in this country, right? And it would then break it down into steps, and then it could say, okay, well, I know I have access to this database, or I have access to Google search, and I can do a Google search. But now what we're starting to see is, you ask that question, and there's an AI agent, and it says, well, I have access to these 6 other AI agents. Each of one can do these different tasks. Who should I kick this over to, and what
like
should
a
I ask them
community
to
of
do?
AIs.
Right. So
like
you have these like clusters. Yeah, these little AI companies, right? Yeah, that's wild. No, it's but the funny thing is they all talk in just English, right? Like they just talk in plain language, so you can basically watch the chat transcripts from what these guys are doing and what they're pulling together. But yeah, we're going to see more of that. I mean, there's going to be essentially these little AI companies, and I mean, to be perfectly honest, we're doing a lot of that at Newsprint. We're certainly not. Maybe as cutting edge as some of the VC-backed companies that are really focused on this stuff, but it's going to become a lot more common, and I'm kind of excited to see where it goes.
So back to the agency world, and there'll probably be creative directors listening to this, hating what I'm about to say. Is anything sacred? So creativity, the ultimate kind of human-focused task, isn't it? Being struck with inspiration in the middle of the night, coming up with an amazing campaign that just kind of cuts through the noise and emotionally connects with people. Are we ever going to have a situation where AI can come up with award-winning creative campaign ideas that connect emotionally with audiences, or is that always going to be something humans do?
So yeah, so my answer to that is that there's kind of two types of problems to solve in general in the world, right? One is just a problem, and you're trying to, and it could be a big problem, like you're trying to solve cancer, right? Or it could be like you're trying to get your car to start, right? And those are problems where, in solving it, the problem doesn't get harder. Like your car doesn't try to stop you from starting it, right? Cancer, I guess, and diseases like viral diseases can actually develop, defenses and make it harder for you to solve the problem as you solve it. It's like a moving target, right? In marketing, in the business world, many of our problems are different in that as you get better at marketing, so does everyone else, right? And so if it gets easier for everyone to make these brilliant campaigns, we're all competing for the same eyeballs, right? Yeah. And the same attention. So it's an arms race to some extent, right? So it's who is better enough that you can break through and kind of solve that problem and be the one who comes up with something truly innovative, right? And so everyone's going to start. Everybody already has access to ChatGPT, and so I think it's going to increase the quality. But everybody's competing with everybody else, and so I do think there's always going to be room for that human innovation because I do think that humans will still be able to come up with the thing that the AI didn't. Like the AI is always going to be deficient at something, and there may be different types of AIs. Some are good at this and some are good at that, but there's always going to be gaps, right? And human beings have always been very good at kind of filling those gaps. And so, I don't think that hey, I have this brilliant idea for a piece of of marketing, this ad that I'm going to run. I don't think that's going away. I just think it's certainly going to change, and the hope is that you'll be able to do a lot more, much more creative stuff, much more quickly. With less money, using some of these AI tools, but it's certainly going to be an interesting time to see kind of what happens and how much better. Hopefully every ad that we see on TV is brilliant and compelling and funny or emotionally riveting. And I think AI is going to make that easier, but it still means that you got to be better than everybody else.
Back in the day, though, back in the 80s, well, because I'm old, but back in the 80s, TV advertisements in the UK, I'm talking here because obviously you're in the US, but they were a lot better quality, or seemed to be. Like people remember things like we had various adverts in the UK, and I've heard various podcasts talking about this. But it had its heyday, did TV? Because obviously, we had we had 3 channels at one point. Then we had 4 channels in the UK. When we got Channel 5 in the UK, 5 channels. It was like a revelation. So people would watch the adverts, but whereas now not so much. So. And when I've listened to creatives that have talked about crafting adverts, they've said that often, like AI is logical. It follows logical patterns that you're looking at and putting. It's a computer at the end of the day. Whereas creativity isn't logical sometimes. Sometimes things that would never have made sense actually the things that stand out the most. I'm trying to think of a great example of something that was.
Well, the classic is the Cadbury. I don't know if you had it in the States. The Cadbury's ad of the gorilla playing the drums to Phil Collins, and it was like a 2-minute ad of this gorilla playing the
Doom,
drums
doom,
to a
doom,
classic
doom.
Phil Collins tune. It was one of their most successful ever ads. But what logic would possibly say, you know what, our audience love gorillas, they love the drums, and they love Phil Collins. Let's do it. Do you know what I mean? It's just it's completely illogical, isn't it? And there's a ton of ads. I mean, it's reassuring actually to hear you say that there's always going to be a role for the human touch when it comes to creativity, and I agree with that. Actually, I think you're right. It's just a suite of tools, and also what I find quite interesting. The quality of ideas gets better, so that in itself presents a problem. It's then much harder to cut through. So let's say we if we increase the quality by 100, great, everyone's got amazing ads, but then everything becomes beige because no one can cut through.
Right. And so I think that if you can cut through, whether it's because you're really good at using the tools or because you do have these really innovative ideas that that people really pay attention to. I mean, a great example. So David Lynch, the film director, who I'm a big fan of, just passed away, unfortunately, last week. And he made Mulholland Drive and the TV show Twin Peaks, and his stuff was extremely weird. Very outside the norm. But it really resonated with people. I mean, he won Oscars, but was also sort of this like critical darling, and a lot of people loved. I mean, tons of people watched Twin Peaks. And he's an example of someone who nothing that he did was logical, right? He couldn't really explain a lot of what it was. Just sort of this intuition around what he should be putting on the screen. And I think, in the age of AI, you're going to have a lot of this. You're going to have Marvel movies, right? And you'll have smaller scale Marvel movies that'll be sort of, maybe CGI will be replaced by AI generated video, right? And it'll just be logical, right? Like, what is a superhero story? Who's the superhero today? It's kind of serialized. But that does leave a lot of room for, I think, true, creativity and innovation and doing things that no one else is doing. And people who do that can get a lot of attention, whether it's, the Cadbury ad or whether it's, David Lynch or whoever. I think that there's a lot of room for that. And I think there always will be. So like, I'm really optimistic about AI, but I'm also in the space. If I wasn't optimistic about it, I don't think I'd be working in it. But yeah, I as someone who really values creativity, I think there's always going to be room for it.
We are all about mistakes on this show, and you've sent one through to us about Google Ads. Now, Google Ads is for someone who deals with data and engineering.
Yeah,
Google Ads sounds like the logical step in a career for a young Jono Matusky. So what happened? What happened there then?
Yeah. So this is an example, I guess, of maybe thinking that you're smarter than you are, right? So post Cuba, like I mentioned, I was working with a bunch of startups, kind of helping with chief of staff, process development, software implementation, and things like that. I generally don't have a ton of official experience in marketing specifically per se. Obviously as a founder, you have to learn a lot about marketing. But the types of stuff that we were implementing wasn't necessarily marketing software. But we had a client who was looking to, they had an agency they were paying to basically run their Google ads. And they asked us, they felt they were paying too much for the agency. That's always a red flag too. If somebody comes for you because they're like, hey, can you do what they were doing, but for cheaper? So they asked us that, and it seemed like pretty straightforward, right? For the most part, they just needed, to keep things running. So we took it on. And at one point they asked us essentially to duplicate one of the ads that they had, but I believe just like change the target audience essentially, or change some of the keywords that they were targeting. And so we did that, we thought successfully. But it turned out that they were essentially using, what we didn't realize is that the previous agency had set up mirroring in the Google ads. So they had, terms in there where the ad copy would reflect back what, I mean, you guys were talking to an audience of marketers, so I feel like I should be the one explaining this. I'm sure everybody already knows. Well, what I didn't realize at the time was essentially that, we knew this, right? We knew that essentially if somebody searched for, this was for a nutrition company, they searched for, nutritionists, in my area or something, it could pull out the nutritionist keyword, and then our ad would say find nutritionists, right? Where if they said search for dietitians, it might say find dietitians, or, just reflecting back their search words. What we didn't realize is that we hadn't filtered out competitors, and we, in our keywords, had added certain competitor mentions. So if somebody searched for a competitor of our company, they would see our ad, but it also meant that we could potentially reflect back the name of that competitor in our ad, right? So if they looked for like, Noom help page, we would in the ad say, click here for Noom, not click here, but like Noom help page, right? So people were clicking on our client's ad thinking, because it said literally the name of the competitor they had searched for. And I guess enough of those got reported to Google that their account got flagged, which is like an extremely rookie mistake, right?
How much did the account spend?
So
Yeah.
a fair amount. I don't want to say how much. I mean, the money wasn't totally wasted in that many of the ads didn't feature, ads mentioning competitors, right? So like they still got a lot of, that was the thing, is we didn't see it in the analytics. Like we were still getting the click-throughs and like things seemed totally fine. But at one point somebody did send the contact thing and was like, hey, I'm looking for, is this Noom? Like I thought this was a Noom thing, and somebody like flagged that to us, and we're like, yeah, that they must have just gotten confused. They said they came in through Google Ads, and we're like, they must have gotten confused. And then, we got a flag from Google. Basically said they took our account down, and so that was a stressful couple of months. It was like figuring out how to deal with that. But the client was fairly understanding. We gave them a little bit of a discount on our services and said that we would, work pro bono and get things back up and running. And we did manage to get them back on Google Ads after a couple of months. But it was just, one of those experiences where, there's certain cases, and this kind of goes back to the AI thing, right? Like there's certain cases where you should just hire an expert, right? And maybe that expert will be an AI. Maybe it's, a human being, but there's certain things like Google Ads where the cost of messing it up is a little bit too high. And unless you want to become an expert in Google Ads, because it is fairly complicated and there is a lot of nuance, and it is this arms race, right? You're competing against everyone else who's running Google Ads, many of whom are very, very well educated in Google Ads. And so unless you have a particularly creative approach, right, or you have a message that you know is going to resonate, or you have a very specific audience segment that's like kind of easy to reach, in many cases, it just makes sense to hire somebody to run it for you, right? And rather than trying to bring it in-house or having your, a consultant that doesn't really know what they're doing, try to do it for you. So I think that's something that I've definitely internalized and have brought to Newsprint, of kind of know when, kind of make, buy, or rent, right? Know when it's worth hiring somebody to do something versus, buying an existing piece of software that can just do it for you versus paying an agency or something like that, or paying an outside expert that can just get things set up for you and make sure everything's running right. That was a particularly embarrassing mistake, because it just really seemed like, total rookie move. Like it's like the worst possible thing you could do. Like if somebody asks you to run Google Ads, it's one thing if you run the ads and they get no clicks, then that's bad. But if you run the ads and you actively get them deplatformed,
that's literally worse than getting no clicks, isn't
exactly,
it? And
right. Like that's the worst,
it's a new client as well. The new client, the first project.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah, we just turned off. Yeah, exactly. We sort of saved them a couple of months of marketing spend.
So that was absolutely fascinating, Jono. I mean, I think
Yeah.
we've covered AI before on the show, haven't we, Chris? But I think that was a really interesting deep dive take on a real sort of specific area of it. And it's fascinating actually as well to hear you talk through your kind of thought process in terms of identifying what that need is before you develop a tool. So that was great to hear as well.
Thanks. No, it was great talking to you guys.